Okay, well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to your neighbours. I hope that you either made some new friends or you've talked through some questions for the panel which we're about to go into. So you've met all the panellists during the course of today, this afternoon. We do have drinks at the end of the panel, so there's definitely an incentive to get through the last bit of today. Of course, everyone is welcome here, and our thanks to Clayton Utz for providing a fantastic venue and AV facilities for this conference here today. It's my prerogative, I suppose, as the guy chairing today, that I'd like to ask the first question of the panel. And I know that you've got different skill sets, so I'm not going to expect everyone to have their 10 cents worth of comment on every single question. But certainly, Tessa, in terms of professional associations having the ability to accept or reject members, what's your thoughts on how the sort of self-policing or self-regulatory system works for associations, and what your thoughts are as to how the Bitcoin community can use what other professional associations like doctors and lawyers do?
Well, thank you. I think that when you've got the medical profession that is highly regulated, or you've got the legal profession being highly regulated, the Law Society, for example, will have some fundamental requirements in order to maintain your membership, using it in a broad sense. And those go to sort of the ethical duties as a doctor or a lawyer. As I said before, I mean, trust is essential in the Bitcoin community. But I suppose I'd sound some caution, because if we set up an association which has a basic code of conduct and then has a system for expulsion, for want of a better word, of those who don't comply with the code of conduct, I just wonder whether we might find that the association's code goes one way and the regulation goes another way. What I think would be, in a sense, more inclusive for the association is to engage with the regulators and figure out what's on their mind. What would they think should be the couple of trigger points for a participant no longer to be entitled to be, use BTC or whatever the moniker is that's going to be used. So I think it's an important question, because people will say, set up an association with some code of conduct or criteria, but there are no teeth in it, so what does it mean? I think it needs to be a two-way conversation with the relevant regulators.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, let's, why don't we go around the room, and if I sort of start on this side and then we'll go around the room. It can be questions, it can be feedback, your thoughts on today. Let's start here. You've been in an interesting business though, because you're in the a platform that's looking after wealth advisors, and the whole issue about, can the association or should the association expel wealth advisors? So I think there's an interesting parallel with what you're involved in. Yeah. Any questions, Zach?
Bitcoin at the moment is still in the not credible phase for them, or is it getting up to the threat phase?
I'm just going to summarise the questions. I think the question is, do we think that in the development of Bitcoin it's still just at the disruptive phase, or that it's gone beyond that sort of phase?
Yeah, I mean, is it I mean, when I first started doing this stuff for ACRA, first started helping them out, it was, the biggest challenge was awareness. Is the challenge now to make sure that it isn't kind of, getting into fights with established players now. It's sort of, is it now about trying to make people realise the opportunity rather than just trying to make
So is it still an awareness raising,
Yeah,
or is it
raising.
opportunity that should be the driver? Oh, I'm going to hand that to someone else.
Well, I guess the consultancy firms and so Clayton Utz and Deloitte would probably be the best to answer this.
Oh, well, I'm just a tax nerd, so that's really where my experience. But I think we're not at the stage where there is a sufficiently mainstream perception of Bitcoin as a transaction medium that it's a threat to the banks. I think there are a couple of people within the banks that see its potential, but I don't think it's. And I talk to my colleagues who are, almost inevitably older, and they see it as a cute little thing rather than anything that's going to really materially impact on the economy. And I think that's the shift that we need to drive over the next couple of years, and I think we need to be honest that it's going to have that sort of time horizon. But I don't doubt with the efforts of ADCA and the like, we're going to actually really start to change that perception.
Thanks. I guess I'll take it one step further. I don't believe that the current status is overtly disruptive, not at this point in time. I think that the technology and the paradigm is a significant enabler for reduction of friction within the economy, and offers significant opportunity for creation of new businesses, new platforms, and new paradigms. So it's a question of where will it go, not where it has been. And that's really up to the group here and others, inclusive of all the players in the financial services industry, and most importantly, pre-existing players. How will they incorporate, innovate, and adopt these particular paradigms? And what is the opportunity that it brings to their customers, who are all of us?
Thank you for that, Ivan. I think one of the questions that I'd like to sort of carry on from that was that one of the speakers today mentioned that they thought the amount of venture capital money in fintech was about $300 million, sort of new investment. Do you have any idea or understanding if that figure's correct? And also, do you have any idea on what amount of money can be disrupted from what you might call traditional services, banking, payments, and be taken over by Bitcoin transactions?
I don't think anyone knows. I don't think it's been quantified. So it's really conjecture. If we look at the three composite paradigms that make up Bitcoin, if we talk about the blockchain aspect, that has the potential to significantly disrupt pre-existing players in terms of exchanges by way of clearing and settlement capabilities. However, whether it will be deployed in a way that it will be adequately adopted, funded, and provide the liquidity necessary is a huge question mark. So I'll say what one of my venture capitalists once said to me: it's all about the execution.
Sure. Would anyone else on the panel like to hazard a guess as to what, or even in percentage terms? I mean, do you think Bitcoin is disrupting 5%, 10% of traditional financial services? Too early to tell?
I mean, don't know, and I guess this is one of the questions perhaps about transparency, that if we had an association that could perhaps provide some indicative volumes, that might help. That might help get some conversation going, and in a sense, get disruption to be seen in a very constructive way, rather than perhaps the ordinary meaning people think, well, that's not a good thing.
Thank you, Tessa. Question: would you, if you want to come up to the lectern to ask a question, because they love recording everything here. Yeah.
Chris from AB Technology. I was talking with a pretty senior banker last week, and he raised an interesting perspective on Bitcoin and the potential future impact, and his angle was that when mainstream adoption happens, and we're talking 20 years, 30 years down the line, when Bitcoin is a global currency, he noted the potential impact on foreign policy and trade policy of individual countries, and the fact that there have then be no trade barriers, and therefore sanctions and other types of trade policy of individual nations will be not as effective as they currently are, because there'll be much less potential to implement capital controls, etc., etc. And I'm wondering whether that is a threat that you think regulators are feeling and trying to do something about, or that kind of macro disruption is not even on their radar.
Very interesting point that you make. So I'm sure everybody heard the question. I would surmise that, firstly, if we look at the various agencies that are involved in US dollar clearing, the State Department, the US Treasury, and OFAC are all quite well linked up. So if we want to use as that example in terms of what the actual potential of not being able to affect adequate policy, because there's the opportunity of circumvention by way of a particular currency's clearing on a global front, that would necessitate the degree to which other nation states hold US Treasury bills. And that's a very, very long way away. However, theoretically, and I'll say as a hypothesis, of course that's a valid hypothesis, but one doesn't know. And even today, sanctions are sometimes circumvented by way of utilization of alternate currencies, such as RMB and Eurodollar clearing.
Yes, I mean, I don't have any examples that might sort of add to the point. I do think it's a very interesting question, because when you look at the levers that are pulled from a sort of global regulatory perspective, the fact that the G20 has was one of its planks from the meeting this last weekend, the harmonisation of regulation. I think they'll just, hop on the bandwagon in the sense that regulators will develop their thinking about Bitcoin, join up, whether it's through IOSCO, BAL, or whatever, and I suppose I just see that there will be global regulation. So maybe I'm naive in thinking that we will get to the stage where it will cut through trade barriers and international regulation. I just think that a framework will be developed.
No, thank you very much, Tessa and Ivan, for that one. Do you want to come up to the mic and ask a question? Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Daniel from Living Room of Satoshi. I was interested to see Finland's recent ruling about the tax treatment of Bitcoin. They've decided it's a financial service, and there seems to be two schools of thought on that at the moment with various countries. And I guess it's inevitable that existing laws are going to be applied to Bitcoin right now. But in your current understanding of what Bitcoin is and how it's used, do you think it makes more sense for it to be treated as a financial service or as a commodity?
From a tax point of view?
Well, as I said earlier today, I think functionally it operates as a currency, and from a VAT design perspective, you exclude currency money from your tax base because it's a means of exchange and a store of value rather than anything which is consumed. Consequently, it makes no sense from a design perspective to drag it in and tax it as a commodity. I wouldn't even see it as a financial service, as an intermediation service. I mean, there are ways that, services related to Bitcoin that provide that intermediation, but it itself is money and therefore properly excluded from the tax base. Now, the extent to which we can do that under our current law, because of the definitions that are there, Michael and I will disagree on until such time as the law is amended. But if you designed a tax you would be crazy to design a VAT today that didn't specifically exclude digital currencies from the tax base and include them within the concept of money.
I'm glad you acknowledge that I'll be correct until the law's amended. Oh, okay. I must have misunderstood. So, but look, I think look and understand the logical philosophical position. It's just that we're talking about the law, so logic and philosophy may not have a part. I think from a practical point of view, it makes, to an administrator, tax administrator, no particular benefit or difference as to whether Bitcoin or any other sort of digital currencies, cryptocurrencies, are regarded as money in terms of tax treatment or not. There's a tax consequence either way. There's practices, mechanisms, things that need to be put in place to make it work. It makes no particular revenue advantage, and there's no particular advantage either way. So in that sense, can be quite agnostic and impartial about it because it has no particular difference. The law just doesn't seem to quite get there at the moment, and that might be enough because we want more time for questions.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Michael. Would you like to come up to the lectern? Go on. You can do it. Yes.
Hi. It's Daniel from Hit Squad here. Yeah, look, my question and comment is just I'm sort of seeing a gulf between the, I guess, the world of traditional financial regulation and the way Bitcoin works. The laws of Bitcoin are defined solely within the code, C++, that runs on everyone's computer. And the original intention was for that code to operate according to its own rules without intervention of anyone, except for being updated from time to time. And then, of course, that's what happens. But so I sort of, when you talk about the regulation and that sort of thing, the implementation of that regulation has to be in that code. And the question is, how do you convince, or how does the association perhaps get input into what goes into that code? And that, I guess, is the governance mechanism totally of Bitcoin. And so I just, wonder if you'd comment on that.
Great question. So I'm sure everybody heard. I think that there is a gulf, as you just mentioned, and most likely because they haven't yet met up. On one hand, you have a paradigm which has been created to allow for a distributed, frictionless environment for exchange of stores of value. Full stop. Doesn't matter what kind of mechanism. It could have been Bitcoin, could have been anything else, but it was designed for a particular purpose in mind. Now, it in of itself has to live within a world that happens to be governed by laws, interoperation, sovereign nation states, commerce, and all of the prospects of normal human commercial existence. Bitcoin is struggling, or as a paradigm, to find its way through that. And one could argue philosophically it is sovereign in and of itself, and that may be a position one could take as a corner solution. On the other hand, when we hear of all the different perspectives of how digital currency could be employed to better our lives and interoperate our existence, then it's a good goal for those of us who work with and contemplate how Bitcoin can be used in a furtherance of its original perspective. Where does it go to next? And of course, the two have to meet somewhere. And when they do meet, it's a question of how that embodiment of everything that's around Bitcoin will be used. Otherwise, how will it be adopted and live and grow. It will be just a corner solution with a limited participation and won't achieve its capability. That's the thought.
No, I agree with all of that, but I do see the challenge, so that if we think of it as, you know, a core that has circling it conventional regulation, if we can, as I said, you know, in my remarks, if we can have interaction with the regulators as a cohesive body, and this is where, you know, the association can have a role, is engage with regulators to educate them, to help drive the regulation, to try and minimise the impacts. I suppose intellectually, I'm not enough of a technology person to see what you were saying. Can we have the code itself being self-regulating? I'm not sure my mind can get around that. If it's at its core and exists as a whole series of transactions, then the characterisation of the transaction is where it would intersect with regulation. So I think there needs to be, you know, as Ivan said, a point of intersection, and an association can help perhaps manage what that looks like.
Andrew?
Just one further thing to build on what you just mentioned, and I think this question really goes to the heart of some of the debate. If we look at a paradigm like the internet, which was created as part of a defense project under DARPANET and then ARPANET, the actual paradigm itself is very well contained. It took some 27 years for it to realize its full potential, and now is the internet or the World Wide Web. And even that, in many respects, has self-regulatory bodies that are satellite bodies, domain name registration, the interoperation in terms of various steering committees, how the nodes work, the routing mechanisms. All of these particular constructs have never usurped the actual core value of the actual paradigm of how packet flow actually emulates. But in order to get it to realize its full potential, look at all the various ways that it had to fit in and morph in order to be able to drive that capability. So on one hand, the actual source code will eventually improve and change and morph, but the way it'll actually be adopted, that's the living creature that has to be adopted and accepted.
Thank you for the question. And any other comments? No? Let's go around the room, the row behind you. And any questions, thoughts or feedback from today? Yes? Do you want to come up to the microphone? Yep. Yeah. Thanks.
Hi there, my name's Andrew. I'm not affiliated with any particular company. I'm just involved with Bitcoin as a personal interest. My understanding is that Bitcoin came about because of perceived or real flaws in the monetary system. And so with Bitcoin, the appeal of Bitcoin to me is its decentralized nature, the fact that it is actually a trustless system because of its absolute transparency. And it just seems through all the discussion that we've had today that the system is trying to make Bitcoin more like the system. So I was thinking in that sense, if you're looking at putting up some kind of regulatory mechanism, wouldn't it be better to actually have a system that doesn't require trust, that has the complete transparency and the ability to interface a little better with Bitcoin? So in that sense, it's sort of like I suppose that's the nub of the statement there. So, should we be trying to make Bitcoin more like the current system, or can we make the current system a bit more transparent and accessible?
I'll have a stab at, from my perspective, what I think your question was perhaps touching on, and a little bit the previous one, and perhaps from a personal perspective as opposed to where the ATO is actually thinking. If you think about just the simplicity of, or that's not simplicity, the simple scenario of some things, current regulation, current law in this country, there's GST on them. And putting aside whether there's GST on Bitcoin, there's GST on them. it would be quite, I guess, elegant, for example, if with coloured coins or some of the core technology of Bitcoin, if when I'm transacting between myself and a merchant, it's known, the system inherently knows this is a GDCC taxable transaction, and in the payment that I make for the goods, or in fact, perhaps to the merchant, 1/11, 10% is peeled off and goes straight to the tax office. So in that sense, the transparency just fits into the system. Now that's from a very, very perpetuating sort of thing of the system, but just in terms of a simple model of that sort of approach, sure, I think that's quite an attractive possibility that might exist from a regulatory point of view, where you in fact might find regulators say, well, there's a rule base if you want to work in society, the society we have, but if the rule base can be woven into some of the underlying technologies in a way that doesn't require extra pieces of paperwork or extra things to happen, it's just inherently in the code, that has some attractions. I think it's complex, but that sort of thing has attractions. So I don't know if that quite goes to where the question was coming from, but that sort of stuff, I guess, is at least technically not impossible, just there's probably other priorities.
I think, again, from my perspective, both the last two questions go to the point of interface between the purity of the Bitcoin system and the inelegance, the impurity of our transactional world. And I think that point of interface, it will be imperfect, but will get better over time. And so I think there will be a skewing of the way in which normal business is conducted by the inclusion of Bitcoin. So initially it's going to be clunky, much like, the internet. Initially it was clunky and it didn't sort of work well. And then over time it changes the way in which normal business is conducted, and normal business adapts to take advantage of the technology inherent in the platform and the purity of the code and the system that's there. So I think we will see an evolution of the business adapting to take advantage of those technologies, whether or not Michael gets his dream of automatically stripping 10% of a taxable transaction out. Again, he and I might differ on that.
Yes, I mean, by extension, I could imagine that ASIC would be delighted if it could have an instantaneous report of transactions as they occur, that would simplify a lot of central clearing if they decide this is some form of derivative. But I don't think that in asking the question, the intention was to sort of, like the Borg, have the regulator kind of morph into Bitcoin and take over Bitcoin. I think it was more to see whether we could have a loosening or an opening of regulation. And I think that is, aspirationally, I can understand where that comes from, but as Andrew says, it might get there over time, but we're going to have a bit of clunkiness in the meantime.
Just following on from the question, I mean, I used to work for an international bank who's just been fined £480 million because they were laundering money for the Islamic Republic of Iran, contrary to UN guidelines. It's ironic that when you mention Bitcoin to people, one of the first things they talk about is, oh, that's fraud, isn't it? And I'm like, well, I think the traditional banking system's pretty good at that, which was the sort of part of the gentleman's question. Is the transparent nature of Bitcoin going to force the traditional banking system to become more transparent, or are we going to be reliant on WikiLeaks for excessive amounts of data dumps on tax avoidance schemes that are being run by international banks because they refuse to move to a more transparent system? That's far too hot potato.
Just to carry on the conversation, I mean, Ivan commented, or I think you did, that fraud, there will always be fraud, and people who will figure out how to defraud a system, whether it's Bitcoin or the banking system, and unfortunately sort of in the nature of human beings, because human beings get involved in these sorts of things, there's that vulnerability. But how you can reduce the likelihood or the vulnerability to fraud is a separate question. And I suppose regulators and taxpayers and voters think that regulation helps reduce the likelihood of fraud. I wouldn't begin to comment on whether it does or it doesn't, but obviously post-GFC, a driver of reducing, major financial failures, regulation has spawned as a result of that. So I guess it comes back to when people talk about Bitcoin being a people-centric, I'm using Mr. Modi's words, a people-centric, people-driven activity, well, actually sort of people are also the people who commit fraud. So I'm not sure we can do too much about that.
Thank you for your comments. Should we go around the room? Any other questions, feedback or thoughts, questions for the panel at the back of the room there? No? Folks at the back? Any feedback or thoughts? We'll have to get some... Yes, please. Ruben, you're going to come up to the mic?
I need to?
Yeah. Go on, yes.
Thanks. I guess a question for the whole panel, probably more specifically for Michael and Andrew. In terms of the tax and the rulings that we've got to and the position we've come to now, looking at the legal side, obviously there are now clear analysis has been undertaken. The next step obviously is enforcement of those guidelines. Goes without saying that's going to be a big challenge, but can you give us some idea of the sorts of tools or programs that might be used in that context?
I can come and show you at your firm tomorrow. Look, I think Bitcoin anonymous, pseudo-anonymous, so is cash. So the tax system, tax regulators, IRS, ATO, Inland Revenue, HMRC, all those sorts of places around the world have had long-standing ways of dealing with unexplained wealth. Transactions by whatever means, with cash, whatever else, people say, well, you can't show I moved A to B. I said, well, maybe I can't show you moved A to B. I just need to show that you've got a bucket load of assets you can't otherwise be explained. And so there's tax consequences for having that. So that, in some respects, those tools have been applied to, say, cash economy. Sort of transactions could be applied in the circumstance of people who don't want to participate in the tax system of the country where they exist. One of the reasons for putting out the rulings was trying to be clear about tax position for people so they didn't make accidental mistakes, so that they could say, see, okay, well, this is the expected tax treatment from the regulator. Can I fit my business model into that tax treatment and still be economically viable and prosperous and develop and grow? So certainty, we figure, is a benefit over uncertainty that previously existed. But yes, with enforcement, you obviously, if you're going to have a set of rules and you expect people to abide by them, you have to be able to follow up. And yes, there are tools to follow up. The blockchain itself, I think, is potentially a fantastic tool for both establishing that a transaction did take place between party X, party Y, for what amount, because the information's there. Once you sort of can talk to a party saying, look, if this is your wallet or this is your address, perhaps we need to know that because it's important and your tax future hangs on it. So I think it's quite a valuable tool, and so we'll make use of the technology itself in terms of helping to provide a predictable, safe sort of commercial environment in that sense. So hopefully that's better than everyone playing guessing games.
Yes, I think from my perspective, one of the important things to remember, and Michael's alluded to it, is that the taxpayer, irrespective of the means by which the transaction is undertaken, the taxpayer bears the onus of proof. And the Commissioner does have this lovely power of default assessments to come in and say, oh, I think you should pay this much tax, and then you get to prove them wrong. That's the way the law works, and the Commissioner does have that power based on all those tools. So, you know, I'm currently spending a large part of every day trying to properly document and present to the Commissioner Bitcoin-related transactions, how that can be demonstrated, whether it's an address-to-address transfer, whether it's handing over control of address by transmission of private keys through BitMessage, a whole raft of different things that can occur. But when you are transacting, you need to remember that you need to be able to prove that and the tax elements of it and what went on to the Commissioner in order to prevail against one of Michael's nasty default assessments. not to you know, make it personal.
Ivan, Tessa, did you want to have add anything to that? Any final comments from some of the sessions that you've heard this afternoon? Would you like to add anything in?
I've personally found it quite interesting sort of coverage today. I think minor technology problem aside, the Skype's good. I'm almost thinking, well, we didn't all Skype in, although there is benefit of communing in person, and of course, if for those people who have a drink afterwards, it's not so much fun having a drink by Skype.
Well done.
And I move on behalf of the panel, and hopefully I can speak on behalf of them, that we would like to say that we've all panelled out. We've enjoyed the day. We hope you've enjoyed the day. And hand back to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Well, please join me in thanking our panel, Ivan, Tessa, Andrew, and Michael. Well, look. That wraps up the day. We're slightly ahead of time, but the drinks are waiting. So on behalf of ADCA and behalf of Ron Tucker, the chairman of ADCA, thank you all very much for coming along, attending today. If you do have feedback, please see Ron, not me. If you've got any great suggestions and ideas, yeah, we're very, very keen to understand what is motivating you, what you think the big issues are, who you think and who you want to hear from. So we want to turn this into something that gets bigger and better. So please either speak to Ron, myself, or anyone at ADCA. Yeah, let's enjoy this evening, and feedback all welcome. Thank you very much, and see you again very soon.